Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the webinar on BBNJ and management procedures, managing fisheries beyond national jurisdiction. I'm Alice McDonald. I'm a senior fishery officer here in the Fisheries and Aquaculture Division at FAO. And I'm really honoured to be joining this conversation as it's a really important topic. Today's webinar is part of the Ocean Foundation's project on management procedures through the Common Oceans program of the FAO, which is funded by the Global Environment Facility, or GEF as we know it, on the ABNJ tuna project. ABNJ stands for Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or in other words, the high seas. And the project's overarching goal is to ensure all major tuna stocks are fished sustainably by 2027, which is really getting quite close now. And we all know that management procedures are a key component of reaching that goal. Today's event is the 12th in a series of 16 quarterly webinars being hosted by the Ocean Foundation that they're hosting over the course of this 4-year project. I'm looking forward to this discussion because there has been a great deal of discussion and genuine excitement around the BBNJ agreement, particularly over the last few months, reflecting its significance as a landmark instrument for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in ABNJ. But now that the agreement has entered into effect, the focus necessarily shifts from negotiation and advocacy to implementation. So it's a good time to move from the dialogue and policy into discussions around practical application and beginning to unpack what the BBNJ agreement means at an operational level. So against this backdrop, today's discussion provides an important opportunity to explore this intersection between the BBNJ agreement and fisheries management, with a particular focus on the role of regional fisheries management organisations. We're honoured to have a distinguished group of speakers joining us today from across the general RFMO landscape. We have Nicola Clark from the Pew Charitable Trusts, Ernesto Penas, who's a former EU official and chair of ICAT, and now an expert and advisor on conservation and management of ocean resources. We have Dr. Quentin Hannock from the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong, and Dr. Adrian Hordijk from Blue Matter Science. The format today will include 4 short presentations, followed by a 30-minute panel discussion and Q&A session. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphone muted and camera off unless you're speaking. We are offering interpretation in English, Spanish, and French, so you should be able to access that now by clicking on the interpretation icon in the bottom of your Zoom window. And just to note that we will be holding all questions until the Q&A session at the end. So at that point, once we have finished the presentations from our experts, we'll be opening the floor to questions and discussion. So please use the raise hand function to ask your questions live, or you can submit a question at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or in the chat. I also want to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly after the event. Without further ado, I'd therefore like to introduce our first speaker. So I'd like to hand over to Nicola Clark, Senior Officer of Ocean Governance at the Pew Charitable Trust. Over to you, Nicola.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much to the organizers for the invitation to join this morning to talk about what is definitely my absolute favorite topic. And that's the BBNJ agreement, and particularly thinking about how it will interact and intersect with some of these other managing bodies, particularly those that manage fishing. To begin with, because my presentation, apologies in advance, there's going to be a lot of acronyms, and I hope that everyone will be able to roll with the punches on the acronym soup that I'm giving. But to give a quick introduction to all of the acronyms of BBNJ. First, let's start with BBNJ itself. So this generally is a shorthand to refer to marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That's where we get the BBNJ from. And the objective of the BBNJ treaty is the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Now, the treaty itself has four components, four package elements. And so some of you may be very familiar with the treaty itself, but for those who this is the one of the first times that you've heard about BB&J, or you've heard about BB&J a little bit, but have not been in the weeds, this is a bit of a primer to just make sure everyone's on the same sort of page. So the four sort of package elements of the BB&J treaty include marine genetic resources, including questions about access and benefit sharing therefrom, area-based management tools, including in particular marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and then capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And then, of course, like all good treaties, it has a number of cross-cutting elements. Things like setting up a conference of parties and a scientific and technical body, and laying out principles and that sort of stuff. The other thing that I think I should flag, the other important acronym to flag, particularly for this group, is IFBs, which in the fishing world refers to international fisheries bodies. But in the BB&J world, it refers more broadly to legal instruments, frameworks, and relevant global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. And the BB&J's relationship to these other instruments, frameworks, and bodies is a really integral question that's been sort of foundational throughout the negotiations. So we use this phrasing a lot: legal instruments, frameworks, and relevant global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. And we needed an acronym for that. And so we've simply used the shorthand, borrowed it from IFBs. And then maybe the other thing to note why everyone is buzzing about BB&J lately is because this new agreement finally formally entered into force in January of this year. After about 2 decades of sort of informal talking about it, and then a final push for treaty negotiations that lasted a couple of years. The treaty secured the final sort of ratification that was needed to trigger its entry into force last year. And so, yes, the sort of international high seas community did a lot of celebrating in the last couple of months at the BB&J's entry into force. So, thinking about sort of some challenges of the BB&J treaty, particularly when we think about fishing and fisheries. So BB&J enters this sort of complicated system of ocean governance organizations, many of which have some mandate or a mandate, like a big mandate, to manage different aspects of biodiversity and or have some competence to manage different aspects of human activities that affect biodiversity. And so BB&J enters this constellation of ocean governance organization, and it sits neither above nor below these other bodies, but alongside them as a sister organization. So BB&J is charged with a number of things. One key one that is sort of emphasized throughout the negotiations and throughout the treaty, and I expect will continue to be emphasized throughout its implementation, is this charge that BB&J not undermine relevant IFBs, those relevant other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. Now, there was an attempt to define further what undermine means, and at the end of the day, there couldn't be agreement on trying to define it more specifically. So quite intentionally, the phrasing is generally in most places left just more broadly, shall not undermine. Now, there's a recognition that undermine is quite a negative framing of the BB&J's relationship with these other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And so there was equally a lot of emphasis to try and be a little bit more positive and frame the positive constructive element of this relationship. So in addition to not undermining, BB&J is also charged with promoting coherence, coordination, and cooperation with and among relevant instruments, frameworks, and bodies. There's also to sort of help ensure that there's reinforcing and consistent activity across different fora. BB&J parties also have an obligation to promote BB&J participating in decision making under other relevant IFBs. And then the BB&J COP is actually charged with making arrangements for regular consultations to enhance that cooperation and coordination with and among IFBs. And this is particularly with regard to area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, as well as helping to coordinate with regard to related measures that have been adopted under IFBs, really just to try and help advance a more coordinated, cohesive approach to ocean governance. And these all sound great. I think one of the challenges will be in defining what these cooperation coordination mechanisms look like in practice and in reality. And that's anybody who was at the most recent meeting of the Preparatory Commission can attest to, there being discussions on trying to flesh this out in a little bit more detail, and there being some challenges in coming to an understanding of how that will work. So perhaps some lessons to be learned from fisheries bodies on things that have worked effectively and worked well in these fora. So just a quick note that fish and fisheries during were very much a topic of discussion and at times tension throughout the BB&J negotiations. In part because, of course, RFMO mandates really intersect with all of the different BB&J elements. And so there's simultaneously this recognition that RFMOs are doing a lot. And we want to make sure that BB&J does not make them less effective or does not make their jobs any harder. And at the same time, a recognition that still, different things, particularly when it comes to conservation, have fallen through the cracks of our current system of ocean governance. So how can BB&J address those governance gaps without undermining RFMOs and other management bodies? Several RFMO secretariats have participated throughout the history of the BB&J negotiations. And I would say, we've noted a definite increase in RFMO secretariat participation in the last couple of years, which I think has been really great. I think it's an important voice to be there during the deliberations. I think very much top of mind for the negotiators and delegates now is thinking about how to understand and establish BB&J different implementation processes and procedures. So at the moment, countries are in the process of setting up rules of procedure, operational modalities for the BB&J's decision-making body, its conference of parties, as well as its scientific and technical body, implementation and compliance committee. And there's very much a recognition that BB&J will interact with RFMOs and other management bodies at many of these different intersections and through many of these different institutions of BB&J. And so how that interaction works, how that relationship can be constructive and collaborative and build off of and not duplicate the efforts of regional fisheries management bodies is very much top of mind for the negotiators. So my particular specialty is on area-based management tools of the BB&J Treaty. I think that's a topic that is of particular interest to those who are coming from an RFMO fisheries background. So I thought I would just really quickly give a couple of details from the ABMT chapter of the BB&J agreement. So first is to flag that the treaty does set out a specific process for establishing area-based management tools and MPAs under the agreement. So I've laid that process out here in the slides. And for anybody who is a very eager learner who has your BB&J treaty text in front of you, the different numbers in bracketed text refers to the treaty text article and paragraph where you can find this reference if you want to read a little bit more details about the process itself. But basically, a BBNJ party would sub or group of parties would submit a proposal. The treaty spells out the elements that must be included in that proposal, including like an identification of the threats to be managed, area to be protected, as well as a draft management plan with draft management measures. And it also includes sort of procedures on how states are meant to develop those proposals, including cooperating with IFBs and other stakeholders to develop the proposal itself. After the proposal is officially submitted to BBNJ, the first step is a preliminary review by the scientific and technical body, just to ensure completeness, to make sure that every box that is required it has been completed and filled out. It then launches a formal consultation process on the proposal that's been submitted. And it spells out different stakeholders that must be consulted as part of that, including Indigenous people and local communities, civil society, and then those IFBs, instruments, frameworks, and bodies, which would include RFMOs. Um, After the consultation, there's then consideration of the input received, then a full review by the scientific body, which is assesses and provides recommendations, and then the decision-making body, the COP, decides whether or not to establish the MPA. So quickly, just to say, the treaty also does spell out sort of what the BBNJ COP can do with regard to establishing ABMTs. So it empowers the COP to establish ABMTs, including MPAs and related measures. It also empowers the COP to establish measures that are compatible with those adopted by other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And it enables the COP to recommend measures to instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And then there's actually another section that deals with emergency measures, and this would empower the COP to establish emergency measures to respond to natural or human-caused emergencies, though they need to figure out a procedure to do that. And they're only meant to use that power if that emergency can't be managed more quickly or effectively by another body. I would say that this section presents a number of ambiguities and challenges that are just worth briefly noting now. So primarily so sort of balanced with these powers is again that charge for BBNJ to not undermine other bodies. So how to balance these and how to ensure that BBNJ does not undermine IFBs in operationalizing these different powers. I think a big sticky question is asking which measures will BBNJ choose to adopt for itself, and which or will they opt to defer some measures to RFMOs or other bodies? Will they do that first? And then also a question of what would make a measure compatible with those adopted by IFBs. So I think a number of instances where we see BBNJ and RFMO potential to interact throughout the process. So in collaborating on developing the proposal itself, formal consultations after the proposal is submitted, potential for an IFB to receive recommendations. And then states parties that are party to both BBNJ and the IFB may have some additional obligations, again, to advance certain proposals or measures within that IFB. I'm just running low on time, so I'm going to just blaze ahead, and I'm sure these slides will be shared with folks and would be happy to discuss more in the Q&A. But sort of my final two slides are thinking about think about how management procedures could serve as an example, things that BB&J could learn from in the RFMO space. So I would argue management procedures, when first created, were quite an innovative governance mechanism adopted by RFMOs to allow the RFMOs to adapt to growing pressures. I think there's a lesson to be learned there, right? Just taking a step back and looking at governance and how RFMOs have adapted. How might we learn lessons learned from that when thinking about adapting for BB&J? MPs also provide an opportunity to consider ecosystems more broadly. They could potentially help inform the draft management plans developed under BB&J. And the presence of effective management procedures could also streamline parties' BB&J environmental impact assessment requirements as well. And I also think there's a lot of opportunity that RFMOs could leverage BB&J as an opportunity. So one, thinking about leveraging data that's going to be collected as part of the BB&J clearinghouse mechanism, and this could be really helpful in informing management procedures. Parties could also leverage BB&J's capacity building and tech transfer requirements, and this benefits parties directly, but it could also benefit RFMOs as well. And then we also see, I could also see BB&J as being a really helpful tool to reinforce and amplify RFMO measures. So, for example, if there's a particular threat to fish stocks that is not fishing, that is beyond fishing, that's some other type of activity or threat, this is where BB&J could be really, really helpful in helping to sort of reinforce those messaging, that action. So, with that, I will pause there. Thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion panel afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Nicola, for that really insightful introduction, the overview of the agreement and procedures, especially as they relate to area-based management tools, and also, importantly, the recap of the new acronyms that this new agreement has brought in, which we do love our acronyms in the fisheries world. So thanks for that. Our next speaker is Ernesto Penas, as I said before, a former EU official and chair of ICAD and now expert and advisor in this field. So over to you, Ernesto.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this interesting webinar when I've been retired for quite a long time already from this. Anyway, I want to use this opportunity to share with you a few points, and I will put them up front so there's no doubt as to what I mean. Right, I want to make basically two very simple points. First of all, although this has already been somehow recognized in the previous presentation, that marine protected areas that are certainly the instrument of choice in this BB&J instrument are not always necessarily fit for purpose, particularly when it comes to open ocean ecosystems. So they are fit for purpose in many instances, but not always. And that implies that certainly we will need to do, in a number of cases, something else to complement or even to replace MPAs. And the second point is that, and this is the whole question that we are discussing today, is that when it comes to a practical science-based implementation of the BB&J measures to protect marine biodiversity, there's probably nobody else around the world who has the expertise, the experience, and I would add the willingness to do that kind of job. So it would be my point that when it comes to implementing BB&J, we should rely as much as possible on those who know. A point of context also is very important to me. We know that fisheries have an impact on marine biodiversity. That's beyond any doubt. But they're certainly not the only human and economic activity that has an impact. I think that we all know that marine pollution, habitat destructions, even noise, coastal development, and many other activities have an impact on marine biodiversity. Fisheries must do its part, but is not the only one who must make an effort here. In other words, we cannot just insist so much on measures by the fishing industry and consider fisheries as the only scapegoat in this kind of situation. So I think this is very important, that we must also, when evaluating the measures, also consider what is the weight and the contribution of those fishing activities in the loss of marine biodiversity, and try to ensure that, as the previous speaker said, many other activities must also be taken to complement the areas of activity where the RFMOs are not competent. So marine protected areas, as I said, are the instrument of choice. But marine protected areas seem to be the perfect instrument for a particular kind of ecosystem, and that is fixed sessile ecosystems that don't move, that are well identified with specific geographical areas and never move from there. So we just establish around those areas a marine protected area, and basically most of what you need to do in terms of fisheries is done through this kind of instrument. I think that is beyond any doubt. In addition to that, if we consider the famous figure of 30% of marine protected areas, and we look into one of the most important marine ecosystems here around the world, the coral reefs, the total area of coral reefs around the world is less than 30% of the total ocean, which means that theoretically we could cover all coral reefs around the world by protecting with MPAs only 30% of the oceans. So I think that in that particular context, the MPAs are an extremely important and useful instrument. The same, and so I think that this is extremely important because it means that the marine protected areas here are the instrument of choice, and so they should be. Then we have other similar cases, for example, over and beyond the coastal and more charismatic coral reefs, we have other kinds of deep water corals that are much farther away from the coast and are deep sea ecosystems not visible for the human eye, but that are also ecologically extremely important from the point of view of biodiversity. And in this case, what I want to underline here is that these ecosystems have been protected already for a number of decades under, for example, the European Union or an RFMO like NEAFC. I've done this work with my very hands for at least 30 years in terms of adopting measures to protect those deep sea ecosystems from fishing. So I think that there is a long history and a lot of expertise and experience by RFMOs like NEAFC and many others in order to protect these ecosystems that are not visible, they are not charismatic, relatively few people knows about them, yet we have always considered they are extremely important for marine biodiversity, and they have been and they are protected. Again, marine protected areas, even though we don't call them like that, is no fishing zones or whatever we call them, but this is the instrument of choice. Even in the context that we see on the right-hand side, the European Union has gone as far as, for example, banning very recently bottom fishing in 87 marine areas of the continental slope, not just on the evidence of existence of very high biodiversity ecosystems, but just on the suspicion of their possible existence. So I think this is a potential of what can be done in this regard by using the closed areas or MPAs or whatever we can call them. My point here is, however, that the MPAs in the open oceans are a completely different thing. So far, we've seen a few cases of fixed bottom ecosystems that don't move. But we know that the open ocean is an open ecosystems with no clear boundaries and where everything fluctuates and moves around. The question is that for this kind of ecosystem and the biodiversity that lives in it, is the instrument of MPA the right one, or is even fit for purpose? Let me just show you a few examples. White shark, an extremely charismatic species that I'm sure all around this meeting we want to protect from possible extinction or from serious problems. Just look at the area of distribution. You may say, well, the dark blue shows major breeding areas. Why don't we protect major breeding areas? Yes, but the area of distribution is so much bigger than those big breeding areas. It's so much bigger than any 30% MPAs we might wish to dream of, that the question is that, well, over and beyond any MPA, what is it that we need to do to protect the white shark, particularly when they just swim freely outside any MPAs we may dream of? This is the kind of problem I want to refer to. Another problem, the green turtle. We also want to protect this charismatic species. And again, the natural area of distribution is so large that is clearly beyond any 30% of MPAs that we can dream of. You may say, well, but we can protect breeding grounds, beaches where they spawn. Fine. But what happens when the turtles are outside those protected areas? Do we need to do something? I would tend to think yes. So what? And that is no longer MPAs. Same thing about common dolphins. So I think that the problem is again and again and again quite similar. In the open ocean, we have a very high number of charismatic species, or species that are less charismatic, but that are absolutely essential for the preservation of marine biodiversity, that cannot be locked in any MPA we may dream of. Typically, and I know this from ICCAT, many of the important fauna that lives in the open ocean, many of the species live, for example, between 70 degrees north and 60 degrees south. That's so much bigger than any 30% MPA we might wish to establish in the future. So the point is, we need to do something to protect those species outside any MPA we might decide to establish in the future. So the question is that who can do this? Then let me just mention a couple of quick examples. The turtle protection by ICCAT, that has been done for decades already. So ICCAT has a very long experience in terms of doing research, for example, which is essential to know where the turtles are captured, incidentally, in which kind of fishing activity they are captured. We have also rescue protocols. We have catch and release obligations. And we have, and this is very important, also monitoring, because our scientists regularly look into these questions. Is this working? Are we improving? Are we reducing or increasing our catches of turtles? And therefore, what is it that we need to do? We need to improve on our record. We need to do something else. Are we failing? Are we succeeding to do the job? So I think that all these elements represent a fundamental basis on which any future activity must be based, because ICCAT has shown knows how to do the job and is monitoring it for decades. Another very good example is that if we want to protect, for example, mortality of dolphins, you know very well, many of you, that, for example, the tuna fishery over dolphins in the Eastern Pacific in the 1980s used to result in the death of 100,000 dolphins per year. It was a massacre. But then the RFMO, the IATTC, established new ways of fishing over dolphins that resulted in a dramatic reduction of dolphins. In the two graphs that you see there, in the upper graph, you see that the number of sets on dolphins is stable. It fluctuates, but basically has not been reduced. So fishermen still fish for tuna fish over dolphins. The practice still exists. However, the dolphin mortality has completely plummeted entirely, and today it's just a tiny fraction of what it used to be. So when it comes to continue fishing while reducing the loss of biodiversity to nearly zero, then IATTC is the people who know. So I think this is a very big success story that we should try to build upon. Then another element, before I finalize, because this is very, very short, another element that I think is absolutely essential is that at the end of the day, and no matter how much we try to combine the sustainable fish exploitation with the preservation of marine biodiversity, there will be inevitably at some stage some discussion as to, well, how much do we need to limit the production of seafood in order to achieve our goals in preserving marine biodiversity? And here the question is that the more ambitious we want to be in terms of limiting fisheries and even aquaculture in some cases, in order that we can achieve our goals on marine biodiversity, this will have consequences on land biodiversity. As you know, now the world produces 180 million tons of seafood per year between capture fisheries and aquaculture. Whatever we reduce from that, for the purpose of preserving biodiversity, we will pay for it on land in terms of having to increase production, for example, of soybeans, which means chopping down more forest and destroying more land biodiversity. So this is a question of an overall balance of how far we can go in the oceans, knowing that whatever we do in the oceans might have consequences on biodiversity on land. And of course, as far as I can tell, nowhere is it written that to save marine biodiversity, we should aggravate the loss of land biodiversity. And then finally, are RFMOs willing to do the job? Because we are talking about RFMOs and the role they should play, but do they really want to get involved in this? And do they really want to have an active role on this? And the answer is yes. This is, for example, just the first part of a recommendation or a resolution that we adopted in ICCAT last year, basically to the effect that we want to be part of this and we are adapting our capabilities as an RFMO in order that we are able to actively participate in this process. And I know for sure that many other RFMOs have done exactly the same. So what I see is that most RFMOs that I know are not only have the experience and the expertise to do this, but they have the willingness to do so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ernesto, for that presentation. And I very much agree with you. It's a point that we try to regularly make in our participation in these processes at FAO is, I think you put it as relying on those who know. RFMOs have been implementing multilateral management of conservation and management of marine resources in ABNJ for many years. And we need to, or many decades, and in the case of the Halibut Commission, I think a century now. So we need to learn from the failures and the successes in their experience. So thank you. Now over to our next speaker, who is Dr. Quentin Hannock, Professor at ANCORS at the University of Wollongong. Over to you, Quentin.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers and all of the participants who've taken the time to join this. I'll just share my screen and, sorry, just hopefully get that going. Right. Okay, so hopefully you can now see my screen. Right, so I'm Quentin Hannock. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Just if you could make it full screen, please.
Right, we got the wrong one. Hang on, I'll just change it onto the... Right, I'll just change that around, sorry. Right. Come on. All right.
Perfect.
Is that okay? Right. Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pull back a little bit and just look at the sort of the broad context for BBNJ and management procedures, and also look at some of the equity and sustainability issues. And in doing so, I just wanted to kind of go back, I guess, to the sort of fundamental points on multilateralism that we really need to work through. And it's effectively going back to, we live in a system of sovereign states, jealous of their powers. And that's a quote from Ambassador Arvid Pardo, who was instrumental in the negotiation of the Law of the Sea, during the second round in the 1960s and then on into the 1970s when we actually successfully negotiated the Law of the Sea. And the point being, however ridiculous or sensible this system is, it's the system that we work within. So we have boundaries and jurisdictions and nation states and governments, and only nation states have any authority in this international framework. That's the framework that we work within, the multilateral fora. But then again, as the previous speakers have pointed out, we also just share this rather small little planet, and it doesn't really matter what boundaries we draw all over that planet. The reality is air moves, fish swim, water changes. So all of those boundaries that we work so hard to establish are completely ignored by all of the fish and the natural environment that we then need to live within. So we have to cooperate. And when we talk about transboundary fisheries, like high seas fisheries, they fundamentally depend on effective cooperation. They depend on multilateralism. We must get together and cooperate, whether that's through the new BBNJ agreement or whether that's through regional fisheries management organizations, International Seabed Authority. The basic reality is we have to cooperate to share these natural resources and to manage these transboundary stocks in high seas. And as has been referred to briefly, one of the most amazing successes of multilateralism was the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that took 3 attempts over 30 years to finally negotiate that. And it really is a tremendous achievement. We kind of take it for granted now, so many decades later. But when you look back at the history of that, it really was quite amazing. It was a compromise between a variety of interests. Um, it's the classic package deal. Everybody didn't quite get what they wanted, but everybody got just enough to think, yeah, there's benefit in this one for me. It's become the constitution of the oceans, and it established all of the key principles and norms for ocean conservation and management, and all of the rights and the duties of the states. BB&J basically is part of this. But also, what it really did was it recognized that coastal states have sovereign rights over their exclusive economic zones, and that sort of fundamentally changed the legal framework for fisheries governance. It effectively established the high seas because everything within 200 nautical miles then became exclusive economic zones. And what that did is it changed the way that we look at the world. It changed the way that we look at maps. So, for example, if you look at this map of the Pacific Ocean, it's the world's largest ocean, covers almost half of the planet's surface. And you look at that and you see a whole bunch of ocean and not much land in it. And if you try to look very closely, you can then see, for example, Kiribati, a country that I used to work for, one of the smallest countries in the world, 33 atolls that are so tiny you can't even see them on this map. You know, literally about 800 square kilometers of land. It's a tiny country when you measure it terrestrially like a landmass. But the law of the sea turned Kiribati from one of the smallest countries into the 12th largest country in the world. Because of the law of the sea, it has a humongous EEZ of over 3.5 million square kilometres, and that brings it both responsibilities to be the custodian and to look after that EEZ, but also obviously the sovereign rights over the resources within that EEZ. And this is really important for how it changes our management framework and how it changes how we think, both about sustainability, equity, compatibility, and high seas as well. And when we look at the Pacific, this is the world's largest tuna fishery. And in that region, you can see that about 87% of all of the tuna species are caught in waters under national jurisdiction. That's the Pacific Island states, which is almost 60%, plus Japan, Indonesia, and Philippines as well. So what you're then looking at, for example, in Kiribati, is a very significant fishery and a very important global actor. 10 to 20% of skipjack, for example, comes from Kiribati's EEZ alone. Now, fish don't pay any attention to any of these maritime boundaries. We still need to cooperate, and the law of the sea was a good basis for that, but it didn't do enough to really detail the cooperation, the duty to cooperate. So in the mid-1990s, we negotiated the Fish Stocks Agreement, and that became really important for modernising fisheries management, strengthening and detailing that duty to cooperate, amongst a whole bunch of other things. And this would be implemented through these regional fisheries management organisations, these RFMOs. So it effectively said, here's our global framework, the law of the sea, but the reality is that we now must manage these resources through regional cooperation. And both previous speakers have commented in terms of the people who have got the experience and the knowledge and the agency and the interest. And those are generally the coastal states within that region and some of the flag states that have also got historical fishing activities as well. We do that through, in the Pacific, we actually do that in basketball courts. We get together every year in a basketball court somewhere generally, and there'll be anywhere between sort of 300 and 700 of us, and we'll sit around a large table and we will negotiate the hard details on how to manage these resources, the conservation and management measures. And often they get down to difficult negotiations because it's not just about conservation and management. Ultimately, it's also about access and distribution. So that's why multilateralism is difficult. And when you look at the decades of history of RFMOs, you can see that there's been a lot of achievements. In the WCPSC, for example, we've made a lot of progress on management procedures, sustainable limits, centralized VMS systems, and a whole bunch of other achievements. And they've been negotiated through 20 years of multilateralism sitting around tables in basketball courts. Now, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement and the WCPSC and all of the other tuna RFMOs, for example, requires that measures that have been established for the high seas and those for the EEZs have to be compatible. And they have to be compatible to ensure the conservation and management of the stocks that go backwards and forwards between them, but they also must ensure that that cooperation is without prejudice to the sovereign rights of coastal states and also to the rights of all states for their nationals to engage in fishing on the high seas. So states have a duty to cooperate to achieve compatibility across these maritime jurisdictions that the fish, again, pay no attention and they swim across all the time. Importantly, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement also recognized the special needs, rights, and aspirations of developing states, particularly the need to avoid adverse impacts on and ensure access to fisheries by subsistence, small-scale and artisanal fishers, women fish workers, and indigenous peoples. And really clearly also that it ensures conservation does not result in transferring directly or indirectly a disproportionate burden of conservation onto developing states. So what does that mean? Well, it basically means that many states, particularly small island developing states, depend on fisheries for food security, livelihoods, revenue, and employment. And the Sustainable Development Goals that guide our development frameworks clearly recognize that, with SDG 14 having the goal of aiming to conserve and sustainably use the oceans and seas and marine resources for sustainable development. Amongst other things, that includes the target of increasing benefits to small and developing states. And that's not just from within their EEZs, that's also from the high seas as well. So we have a development framework, we have commitments and obligations around equity and development, and these are all critical components of our high seas governance framework. What we've also seen at the same time, though, over the last 30 years is a plateau of our fisheries. And you can see that very clearly in the FAO reports that year after year demonstrate that since roughly about the 1990s, it doesn't matter how much more capacity we pour into our fishing fleets, how much more smarter they get with satellites and AI and technology, or how much more effort that they're able to produce on the fisheries, we don't catch any more fish. So we're basically flat. It doesn't matter how much we work, we can't get any more fish out of our oceans. Their oceans are finite. So what we're seeing is that the growth in fisheries that's occurred over the last 30 years has really come from aquaculture. It hasn't come from the marine fisheries. And again, what we also see is that we still have significant problems with fishing, that many of our key fisheries are overfished or in a state of overfishing, and that most of our fisheries are fully fished. There really isn't much room in our world's fisheries to actually catch anything else. In fact, what we actually need to do is for some fisheries, we really need to be restraining effort to rebuild those fisheries. And at the same time, we haven't been very successful on combating climate change, and unfortunately, climate change is also beginning to more and more impact on our oceans. And that's having potentially disastrous impacts on our fisheries, with expected changes in maximum catch potential projected to decrease by up to 12% in the next couple of decades. There are significant geographical differences in how that impacting harder on the tropics than it does perhaps in the Arctic areas, but it's clearly changing our fisheries. And again, most of my history has been in the Pacific Islands, so we've done a number of studies on how that's likely to impact, and we really see matters of concern because the changes in distribution and productivity are likely to harm Pacific Island states, particularly those Pacific Island states that have few other alternatives for food or economic development. And these are key concerns, and this is the context that we're working within when we're talking about high seas management procedures and BBNJ, for example. So, in summary, fisheries inherently require conservation and management to ensure the long-term sustainability and avoid declines in productivity or collapse. We know that. Ecosystem integrity is critical, and that requires the protection of the marine environment and the associated and dependent species and habitats. Again, nothing new there. We've been talking about that for 30 years. The law of the sea, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement apply obligations to implement those protections and apply a precautionary approach and ecosystem-based management. Again, we've been talking about that for 30 years. And now this is all further elaborated by the new BBNJ Treaty and its protections and consideration of high seas biodiversity. When we want to achieve these goals and we want to recognize the realities of a finite system, then we need to put in place limits on fishing mortality. And we can do that in a number of different ways. We can do that through gear controls, catch limits, seasonal closures, effort controls. But all of those measures will impact upon states and stakeholders to varying degrees, potentially applying a disproportionate burden onto developing states, which is clearly contradictory to our international commitments. Regardless, within that context, developed states have traditionally advocated for conservation and management limits to primarily be based on historical catch or effort or capacity. The problem with that is that they may inadvertently lock out developing states that haven't had the capital or the capacity to develop their fisheries yet. And if you do that, then that could also cause a disproportionate burden, again, clearly contradictory with international commitments. So in the context of the Western Central Pacific fisheries and the Indian Ocean fisheries, these two tuna bodies have basically almost 3/4 of the world's tuna. Both of those RFMOs hold mandates to apply conservation and management measures throughout the range, both in EEZs and on the high seas, and both of those RFMOs are utilising management procedures for key stocks, negotiating harvest control rules, and really importantly, negotiating the objectives of how they actually want to manage these fisheries through these management procedures. But both of those RFMOs still struggle with many of these difficult questions around equity and development. So, for example, WCPOC includes broad exemptions on applications of measures so as to avoid a disproportionate burden. And that can include various different measures. But when we talk about that in the context of management procedures, that's different to the carve-outs that we are seeing develop for limited EEZs that are intended to avoid potentially conflicting application of multiple MPs. So there's a little bit of subtle difference there between how we actually implement MPs for scientific and management reasons and also how we do it for equity and development reasons. We've also seen similar issues in the ITC where some parties are opting out of ITC resolutions due to their concerns that they perceive that they might be applying a disproportionate burden on them. The reality is that exemptions and opt-outs weaken the integrity and effectiveness of management procedures. We really need to find solutions and innovative frameworks so that the management addresses all of the fishing mortality that actually then enables us to achieve our goals. Meanwhile, climate change is accelerating, and simultaneously, the BBNJ agreement has importantly now focused global attention on broader biodiversity conservation needs for high seas and also our commitments to 30 by 30 and other conservation goals, while also then identifying these new opportunities, providing support for capacity building and technology transfers. So, in order to ensure the integrity of management procedures and avoid weak implementing measures, RFMOs have to find a way through this, and ultimately so does BB&J, to address these equity concerns and develop equitable pathways to sustainability. Yeah, for example, the WCPC, the Western Central Pacific, last year adopted a management procedure for South Pacific albacore, and that took a lot of work by a lot of people over a lot of years. It was a compromise. Many of the Pacific Island states wanted a much more precautionary management procedure that would more quickly rebuild albacore stocks to more profitable levels. Other states, not so much. So at the end of the day, we had a negotiation and we achieved a compromise that does enough to get us there. It's a management procedure and it's a really important achievement. But now we also need to negotiate the implementing measure for that agreement, and that ultimately comes also down to allocation. How much of the eventual limits that come out of that MP are going to go to the high seas, and how much of the limits will go to the EEZs? In the Pacific region, the Pacific Island states, Australia and New Zealand have already agreed on how to allocate between their EEZs. So it really comes down to these broader issues of the ratio to the high seas and the ratio to the EEZs. And also there's other complicating factors about how the MP for albacore, for example, will also then be compatible and implemented alongside MPs for other species that are interrelated, like big eye, for example. So, in conclusion, when we're talking about the evolution and development of management procedures and how we address these other broader issues like biodiversity, we need to be thinking about the objectives that we're setting for the management procedures. But in so doing, we also need to remember the need for the cooperation and the multilateralism, and our decisions need to limit fishing mortality in such a way that distributes the benefits but avoids a disproportionate burden on developing states that is clearly compatible with all of the international commitments that we've all made already. And also the political reality of this. States are unlikely to consent or implement, I mean, it's their sovereignty, they're unlikely to consent or implement to management procedures or BB&J measures where they perceive their interests have been marginalised. So there's an agency and a political reality that we all must accept and then work within when we're talking about BB&J and high seas and RFMOs. So really it becomes down to how will BB&J and these broader conservation values now intersect with the MPs and their objective setting in this complex space. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions later.
Thanks, Quentin. Thanks for taking us back to that big picture and reminding us of the big wins of the Convention on the Law of the Sea and Fish Stocks Agreement, but also noting that we do still have challenges, stock sustainability, climate change, equity, and others. But thanks. Always appreciate going back to the Pacific, even if only virtually. Our next speaker now is Dr. Adrienne Hordick, the director from Blue Science Matters. Blue Matter Science. Apologies, Adrienne. Over to you. You're on mute, Adrienne.
There we go. Thanks, Alice. I'm going to start with a quick apology. I came down with a cold the last few days, and I've got this horrible cough. So if I have I need a break for a coffee fit, I apologize, and I'll try remember to mute to spare you all. Yeah, thank you all. I'm giving a presentation on simulation testing management procedures for community managed octopus fisheries. So this work is on Octopus cyanea. It's commonly known as the big blue octopus or common reef octopus. They are the most common octopus species in coral reefs and rocky habitats around the world. And they support fisheries throughout the tropical and subtropical regions of the Indo-Pacific, from essentially East Africa all the way through to Hawaii. They have a very short lifespan, like a lot of octopus that live for 12, 15 months. Really rapid growth, reaching a size of about five kilograms. So they get quite big very quickly. And they support the high value artisanal fisheries all over Indonesia, and then in Madagascar and in East Africa as well. Most of the catch exported to Europe. Octopus are caught throughout Indonesia, almost entirely by small-scale nearshore fishers. They operate in nearshore shallow reef flats where they wade with and catch octopus by hand spearing or sometimes spear guns. And then they use wooden or fiberglass vessels to get out to deeper waters. They used to dive out in deeper waters, but about 10 years ago, a new jigging method was invented or was introduced into the region. It's called umpan. And this is typically an empty crab or a lobster shell filled with concrete and then with fishing hooks protruding out the side, and they use it to jig up and down, catch octopus. And more recently, there's plastic versions and synthetic versions, more sophisticated ones have become available and common. While I was looking for some photos for this presentation, I found a whole lot of these jigs available on Alibaba, so you can buy them now. This umpan gear was really successful, and it led to a massive increase in catches the first few years after it was introduced. This study was focused on an octopus fishery in the southeast coast of Simeulue Island, and that's an island off the coast of Sumatra, one of the biggest islands in Indonesia. These octopus fisheries, this case study was focused on these fisheries here in the southeast corner of the Simeulue Island. They're fairly typical. This octopus fishery here is fairly typical of the fisheries throughout Indonesia. When it was introduced here, the umpan gear, the jigging gear, was very successful and led to a rapid increase in catch rates. But then after a couple of years, not long, the fishers started to report quite a major decline in catch rates. And so now, from interviews from a couple of years ago, the fishers are reporting that their catches are about 50% lower than 10 years ago. And so there's all the classic signs of overfishing with a decline in average size and longer trips required to maintain catches and so on. So this fishery is highly valuable, and that the fishers recognize that something needs to be done to improve this fishery. And because it's a small scale fishery, the vessels are all less than 10 GT, the octopus fishery is exempt in Indonesia from any national fishery management measures. So it's essentially unregulated and unmanaged. However, Indonesia has a long history of community-based management. It's known locally as SASI. And so local NGOs have been working with the Simeulue community, in fact, similar communities all over Indonesia, to collect data on octopus data, mainly length and weight measurements, but also some catch and effort data. So you can see the figure at the top there shows a histogram of the weight composition. This is collected over the last 3 years, about 12,000 samples. You can see most octopus are around a kilogram. So start catching them around 250 grams. The average weight is 900 grams. And then a few animals in a catch nowadays get out to above 2.5 kilograms. So they're quite rare now to catch the much larger octopus. The community has been implementing some voluntary management measures, primarily time area closures, no fishing areas. However, there have been no analyses to help design these special closures or to explore the expected performance of other management measures. They've just basically tried an idea in various places and tried these closures and put them in place for a period of time and wait to see what happens. So the lack of the full analysis, I've been able to provide some recommendations on the length, the duration, or the size of these spatial closures and compare other management measures. And that was a problem that this research was aimed to address. So there were three objectives to our work. It was firstly, to use simulation modeling to identify robust management methods or management procedures for these octopus fisheries, and then to use those results to provide the communities with the trade-offs and the expected performance of the different management approaches, and then for the communities to use those results to develop their own harvest strategy and prioritize data collection and monitoring for their fishery. So at this point, some of you may be wondering how this work on a small scale nearshore octopus fisheries relates to the BBNJ agreement. While this fishery is obviously not in areas beyond national jurisdiction, I think there are lessons that can be learned from this work that can be applied to thinking about management procedures in the context of helping to meet the BBNJ objectives. First, there's a lot of uncertainty in the stock dynamics and the exploitation history of the octopus fisheries. Just know very little about the biology, and despite the data being collected in the last few years, very little about the history of the fisheries. This is likely also to be true for many stocks that fall under the BBNJ agreement and that aren't currently being managed. So this octopus case study is an example of building operating models and doing simulation testing of various harvest strategies or management procedures in a low information context. Secondly, many simulation analyses and MSCs are primarily focused on TAC controls, output controls that limit the amount of catch. This analysis on the octopus explored a wider range of management approaches, including, like I mentioned, spatial management approaches, as well as size limits and other things. And these other management approaches may be, and as we heard, particularly area-based management, are likely to be important under the BBNJ agreement. And last, in cases where it's not possible to do stock assessments to estimate stock status, so of course this octopus fishery and the vast majority of fish stocks, management objectives may need to be focused on general trends rather than specific biological reference points. So for example, improving or stable or declining. So in this case, that was the case for this octopus fishery, where the primary objectives for the communities were to firstly, ideally, to improve the conditions of the fishery, just get things better than they were today, than they are today, or at least set up a system that's robust to exploitation, increased exploitation in the future, so to prevent things from getting worse. So the operating model was built to incorporate this uncertainty in the knowledge of the fishery. So basically all aspects of the biology and exploitation were unknown. Some information we're able to obtain from local studies on maturity, for example. There have been some studies on growth in nearby regions. Where possible, the information for the operating model came from the local data, and otherwise it came from published literature from octopus fisheries elsewhere in Indonesia or around the world. These plots that I'm showing here just are essentially maturity and weight schedules and selectivity and so on, all the different parameters that describe the population dynamics or the fishery dynamics in the operating model. And the point here to show here is that all these lines are various stochastic samples, random samples of these different parameters to try and incorporate that uncertainty as much as we can in the operating model. So the result is this. This is a simulated historical fishery. In this model, it starts about 30 years ago at relatively lightly fished conditions. And then in around 2010 or so, there was a large increase in fishing pressure. And you can see on the left, the biomass has been quite a rapid decline in biomass over the last 10, 15 years. And you get the classic sort of overfishing signal in the landings, the catch on the right, where you get increases in catches to a maximum around mid 2010s, and then fairly rapid decline in recent years. This isn't conditioned on the data. This isn't exactly what's happened in this fishery, but this is mapping out a whole range of scenarios that describe fishery dynamics that, based on our understanding of the fishery from the data, literature, and interviews with the fishers, captures the sort of general trends of what's going on in this fishery. And so the idea here is to look at a range of different management procedures and see how they are likely to perform in managing, rebuilding, stabilizing an overfished octopus population. So we have 6 general families of management procedures, minimum size limit, seasonal closures, and so on. In this talk, I'm just going to focus on spatiotemporal closures. And then we had, for the projections, two effort scenarios. So either perhaps an unrealistic scenario where effort's frozen. So going forward in the future, these other management procedures are implemented, but there is no further increases in fishing effort. And the second scenario was increasing effort, and that's where the fishing effort continued to increase by the same general trend it has in the past, about 2.5% per year. So there's basically increasing fishing pressure as time goes on. So this is just a one slide of results that I'm going to show. We looked at different size areas closures, but this particular set of results from a 25% area closure, or really that means 25% of the octopus fishery, octopus habitat. And then we look, so the columns here are in this plot are the months, that the duration of the closure: 1 month, 3 months, 6, 9, and 12 months. And then the line on the top row shows the biomass, relative biomass. This is in the projection period, so that all starts at the same place. And then the various trends are due to the different duration of the closure, and the plot on the bottom shows the catches in the projection period. The two lines, the solid and the dashed line, represent the frozen and the increasing effort scenarios, respectively. So, I mean, there's lots of results in this analysis and lots we could talk about, but we have limited time. So just sort of briefly, like under the 1 and 3 month closures here, both the biomass and catch continue to decline in the projections, especially under the scenario where effort continues to increase. In the 3 month closure, you can see there's a short-term increase in catches when the area is open to fishing, but this doesn't have a long effect as the population, the biomass, continues to decline. And this is exactly what's been found in communities in Indonesia and elsewhere, where they have done some of these short-term closures. They found a short-term sort of boost to the catch rates and the size of octopus, but fairly quickly that benefit disappeared, and they were back to where they were before, while things continued to decline. The longer duration closures have a greater impact on stabilizing and increasing biomass and catches. And so the spatial closures need to be in place long enough and be large enough to be robust to particularly this probably more realistic scenario in a place like Indonesia, where it's very difficult to control fishing effort. And so if fishing effort's likely to be uncontrolled and continue to increase in the future, these sorts of management procedures, management approaches need to be need to be robust. They need to be designed in such a way that they can provide the protections under those conditions. We also explored rotational closures, where an area was closed for a period of time and sort of the closed area rotated around the fishery. That those results were similar to the fixed spatiotemporal closures, but under some conditions had better performance. So it depended a bit on the context. The other, I have not shown those results here, but the other thing that was really interesting for octopus was to show how the expected outcome of minimum size limits or minimum weight limits, which showed to be really quite effective. I was quite surprised at those results. But given that their growth is exponential, essentially exponential, not catching octopus while they're small and waiting until they get larger means you can get a massive increases in catch in terms of weight. Okay, just a couple of conclusions. So octopus life history is kind of unique, as we all know. It's short lifespan and rapid growth, so it's highly responsive. So these results, we did the same analysis on other species, lobster and some reef fish species. And so the results depend a great degree on the biology of the animal, and also, as we heard earlier from earlier speaker, on the movement characteristics of the stock. Things like octopus are quite sedentary. They have dens where they live, and they don't move a lot. And so these spatial closures were quite effective for those. Less so for some of the fish species that had greater movement rates. But also, probably more importantly, the greater longevity and slower growth of lobster and the finfish means that even when these management approaches are successful in protecting the population, it takes a long time to see the rebuilding. With octopus, you've got a new generation every year and a half or so. Number two, simulation modeling was sort of the best tool to use to evaluate spatial management. What they had been doing so far is just putting management spatial closures in place for a certain area for a certain period of time, whatever the community kind of decided upon. This framework, this simulation framework, gave us the ability to kind of test these different approaches and provide some recommendations to communities to help guide their decisions going forward. Like I already mentioned, some of the other effective minimum size limits and rotational closures were quite effective. And of course, you can do some sort of combination of different harvest approaches. Probably most importantly, really, controlling fishing effort is most important for robustness. I forget who said it, but one of the earlier speakers made that point as well, that the real problem in fishing is controlling efficient effort and in cases where there's too much fishing effort in trying to reduce that. Because that's ultimately the thing we're trying to do when we're managing fisheries, at least, is to keep fishing mortality low enough to maintain sustainability. And that can be very, very challenging to reduce fishing effort once it's already there. And finally, this is a data limited fishery, very little knowledge of the biology, but this hasn't been a barrier to building operating models and evaluating alternative management approaches and being able to provide advice to, in this case, the community managers to help them make their decisions about how they want to manage their fishery going forward. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to the chair.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Much appreciated. Really interesting to hear about this example of how management procedures, simulation modeling, etc., can be used to develop spatio-temporal management. And there's clear lessons in this for how it might be scaled or used in the context of BBNJ, and the reminder that data and knowledge isn't or shouldn't be a barrier. I also appreciate the linkage that you made to people. I think so often when we're talking about management procedures and global instruments like the BBNJ and RFMOs, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we're talking about real people, real fish, and the livelihoods of real fishers. So thanks very much for that. Really appreciated. So now it's an opportunity for us to stop talking and for the audience to ask any questions or make any comments about the presentations you've seen. And I suggest you do, otherwise I've got some curly questions for the speakers myself. So the floor is now open. Please do raise your hand if you have a question, or if alternatively, you can type a question into the Q&A option, which I think is down the bottom on the More button. Anyone out there willing to raise their hand and break the ice? Save the speakers from my questions. Ahmed, did you want to ask a question?
Oh, yes, I will sacrifice.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My small minor question to the second speaker. First of all, thank you very much yourself, and thanks for all speakers to take us through these very interesting presentation. But my small question is about the coastal development, how relevant to the BBNJ, because we, as an example, and I think he also elaborated on so many other issues, but certainly this might be important to try and avoid any confusion. How the coastal development could be relevant, other other than its biodiversity and relevant between, but how to maybe he can elaborate a bit more on this this particular point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. I think that question was for you, Ernesto. Over to you.
Yeah, I think so. Well, there can be a number of elements that that kind of link the question of coastal development to the preservation of biodiversity in the high seas. I think that if you recall the areas of distribution of species, they go from the very coast to the very high seas. So there's no continuity. There's full continuity in areas of distribution. Just think, for example, of certain species that may have breeding grounds in mangroves. You develop coastal areas, you can actually destroy breeding areas for a number of species that then can also be found in the high seas. Just think, of course, of a coastal development that will occupy a very nice beach with hundreds of tourists that will prevent, for example, the natural and healthy reproduction of sea turtles. The more you develop breeding grounds, the more you can actually affect the reproduction of turtles that then are actually species occurring in the high seas and that would fall under the responsibility of BBNJ. So there's a continuity between a number of species that actually occur in the high seas and some of the areas where they can breed. The same happens, for example, with certain birds. Certain coastal development can also affect nesting areas of seabirds that then can occur in the high seas. So the question is that the high seas is a very wide area where many of the species that can be found there are also species that can occur in very coastal areas and be affected by coastal development. Even take, for example, eels. Eels do reproduce in the Sargasso Sea, but then they go to rivers to become adults. The more you develop land ecosystems, you can, in fact, basically prevent the eels from going back to the rivers, and therefore you can affect the whole biodiversity of that species. So I think my point is that coastal development is just one of those elements where species that occur in the high seas can also have breeding grounds or also complementary habitats, and therefore you cannot just distinguish the high seas from coastal areas in all species. We know that for some species they appear in coastal areas but not in the high seas. But many of the species that occur in the high seas actually do reproduce or do occur in very coastal areas where they can be affected by coastal development.
Thanks, Ernesto, and thanks very much, Ahmed, for the question. There's another question I see in the Q&A, and this is for Nicola, I understand. And the question is about membership in the BBNJ decision body. Are the RFMOs present in this body? How? And if not, is their role only as advisory when proposals are put on the table? Over to you, Nicola, if you'd like to answer this one.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the question. So the members of the BBNJ decision-making body or the Conference of Parties is all countries that are parties to BBNJ. So while RFMOs do not have a seat at the decision-making table in the sense that RFMO secretariats don't have the seat at the decision-making table, but from another perspective, right? RFMOs are really, I think, Quentin has used this analogy before. RFMOs are just a table, different tables where states parties come and convene and gather. And so, in the sense that you have countries that are a member to both RFMOs and to BBNJ, of which there are many, right? Many of the parties to BBNJ are also members of several RFMOs. So there's a lot of overlap. So I suppose it's really then incumbent upon states parties to make sure that they have a holistic approach to their decision making, and that when they are coming to BBNJ, it is informed by their work at RFMOs, and so decisions they're taking at BBNJ is informed by the work and decisions at RFMOs, and vice versa, right? When they come to RFMOs, they're also making those decisions at RFMOs informed by their work at BBNJ. So I think it goes both ways. And then to say, in addition to, of course, states being the decision makers and playing that important role in connectivity between the different fora, it is the treaty does provide for RFMO secretariats and other management bodies to participate in the BBNJ COP and other body and other sort of institutions as an observer. So similar to how they've participated at the BBNJ PrepCom, RFMO secretariats and other RFMO secretariat staff would be able to come and to observe and to receive the different materials and documents, and would also be able to sort of make interventions and participate that way. So while they don't have a formal seat at the decision-making table per se as the Secretariat, perhaps most appropriately that it is those parties, those governments that will have the seat and really should be, in an ideal world, acting consistently across the different fora.
Thanks, Nicola. There's another question on the Q&A. This is a more technical question, so I think it's probably for Adrian. And I'm not sure if I'm going to get the pronunciation right, being not a very technical person myself. But the question is, as a semmelparous species, octopus fisheries are essentially recruitment fisheries, with recruitment highly dependent on the environment rather than spawning biomass. How does that affect OM performance and management procedure selection? Are you interested and capable of answering that, Adrian?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. A good question. Yeah, no, it's true. So octopus are like short-lived and they like highly variable recruitment, which basically means that recruitment can be really high in some years and extremely high in some years, some seasons, and extremely low in others. What that means is that it's quite difficult to use like a historical data to tell you something about the current state of the population, and so that's what we found. We tried to develop some sort of more typical management procedures, which are dynamic and use fishery data to update management advice, and we found that it wasn't that didn't perform that well at all compared to these more sort of static harvest approaches, strategy approaches that we use. So it does affect the performance of the management procedures, and you can tell pretty quickly, especially as you kind of in a simulation model, you can dial up that recruitment variability, and you can see at what point it starts to break down the information in the historical data starts to break down and become less useful. So thanks. I hope that was provided an answer.
Thanks, Adrian. Certainly a far better answer than I could have attempted. So much appreciated. Now we are coming to the end of the time. I understand we can extend for at least maybe another 5 or 10 minutes if there's some other key questions around, and would ask kindly that the speakers at least stay on the line for a few more minutes to answer questions because we still have some more incoming. So just one last call. Please do raise your hand if you have a question. I've got one more question on the chat. And the question is, what is needed to reconcile the mismatch between the urgency for ocean action to conserve biodiversity with the slow incremental process of multilateralism? I think that's probably a question for you, Quentin, based on your presentation, but also to evenly share questions across the group. Would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, look, thank you for the question. And I think anyone who's spent time in multilateralism um, knows the grind of making decisions and negotiating them over multiple meetings and the need for engagement. So I don't actually have an easy answer for that, other than um, lack of capacity is often a constraint in terms of progress on actually adopting a decision. And by that I mean you've often got a lot of corporate turnover and government officials attending meetings, and you've constantly got to make sure that you're regularly updating the new officials with what's actually going on, the context and the interests and the play. So I think it's always important to ensure that everyone that is actually attending the meeting has had the capacity to prepare for that negotiation and fully understand the issues and fully understand their interests. Because you often see negotiations get bogged down into stalemate and really slow down when delegations are uncertain about how this proposal will impact on their own national interest. So in that sense, I think that capacity and that engagement's critical. Um, I guess also the other aspect on that too is at the end of the day, the representatives who attend these meetings are simply representatives of the population that they come from. For example, if I'm on an Australian delegation, that delegation is supposed to represent the national interests of Australia and is clearly also supposed to represent a whole of government view of Australia, not just a vested interest perhaps from some industry. So it's important within that context to ensure that there really actually is a whole of government engagement. And that means a lot of homework back home. And I think often what ends up happening is with international negotiations and multilateralism, it occurs far away. It's often in a foreign city, and it's often somewhat abstract. And you certainly see that in New York. In New York, you've got commissioners and representatives who don't know the technical nature of the negotiation they're participating in. They're generalists who've been posted there and are now negotiating something and something different the week before and something different the week after. So really ensuring that governments actually are able to engage at that sort of whole of government coherent level enables multilateralism to proceed more quickly, and then also ensuring that everyone's actually got the capacity to fully engage. Thank you.
Thanks, Quentin. And I'd certainly, echo the point around the importance of intra-governmental coordination. What we're seeing in these BBNJ processes, the delegations, the delegates around the table, who, as Nicola pointed out, are the decision makers, are usually, or at least dominated by foreign affairs or environment ministry type of people. There's not a lot of fisheries delegates around the table who are understanding and engaging in the process. So obviously not everyone can be there in the room. So intra-governmental coordination back in capital between environment, foreign affairs, fisheries, etc., would hopefully help with some of that coherence. And I'll take that opportunity to give a really gratuitous plug to an FAO publication on fisheries and the BBNJ agreement, which the whole point of it is to help fisheries people improve their understanding of what the BBNJ is, what it might mean, and then engage in the process so that we can start influencing it. We have one last question, which is quite a nice round question, and maybe a couple of the speakers might like to give a short answer to it, and it's on the Q&A, and that is, will the BBNJ influence RFMOs, or will RFMOs influence the effectiveness of the BBNJ? So which of our speakers would like to give their thoughts on that? And they might be different, which is also very welcome. I'll start with Ernesto and then Quentin.
Yes, I think that my short answer would be that the more BBNJ relies on RFMOs, the better. And I think that I would like to echo a comment that has been made before by a previous speaker about the kind of nature of the delegations that attend, for example, BBNJ. In the case of the EU, that I follow that quite a lot, even if I didn't myself participate, the level of expertise was not necessarily impressive. I mean, there were lots of people, specialists in international law, environmental law, but very few people, if any, really having a practical knowledge of fisheries. So I think that if the BBNJ really wants to have success, I will repeat my intervention before. Please try to rely more, as much as possible, on those who know. And those are the RFMOs.
Thanks, Ernesto. Quentin, your thoughts on that question about will the BBNJ influence RFMOs or will RFMOs influence the effectiveness of the BBNJ?
I hope it goes both ways. To me, the future of BB&J is strengthening integrated ocean governance. In 10 years' time, I hope that BB&J will actually ensure a more coherent whole of government engagement in ocean governance more broadly. In order to participate in BB&J and RFMOs and everything else, governments will need to actually ensure that their delegations do represent whole of government, and that requires that they talk to each other before they actually leave capital. So my hope is that what this will do is catalyze governments and parties to actually ensure that they go to an RFMO with both environment and fisheries on their delegations, and they go to BB&J with everybody who's got an interest in that issue, and that way we end up with a truly coherent ocean governance framework. So that's my optimistic take on it. It should go both ways.
Thanks, Quentin. I see much nodding. I'm not sure whether any of the other speakers wanted to chip in.
I might quickly, if that's okay, Alice, just to really to say ditto to Quentin. My answer would be it's not an either or, that it's a both. That BB&J and RFMOs will influence each other inevitably. And I think, this is built, that's the vision of BB&J as well, right? It's not to create a one-way street with BB&J dictating to RFMOs or the other way around, but really truly meant to be a collaborative, coordinated effort, with RFMOs very much having an influence on what BB&J does, through so many different mechanisms, through sort of participation of fisheries interest via state parties at BB&J, via RFMO observers at BB&J, and ensuring that expertise is built upon, to Ernesto's point, and not duplicated. I think would very much agree that we should be, that BB&J should build upon the work and expertise of RFMOs. But vice versa, right? There's also obligations for parties at BB&J to take sort of what happens at BB&J, and ensure that is considered by RFMOs. So Quentin said it much more eloquently. So really just to sort of to echo his points and say I very much think and hope that it will be a two-way street of mutual reinforcement. You're muted, Alice.
Alice, we can't hear you.
I didn't say anything important, but with that excellent rounding out question and the very optimistic answers as well, I think it's a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you very much to the speakers today for your thoughtful presentations and insights. It was a really interesting discussion. Importantly, thank you to the Ocean Foundation and also the project partners, Pew and the FAO Common Oceans team, and of course the Global Environment Facility for making this work possible. I'd like to thank Shana and Heather, who are in the background, but who did all of the work to put today together. Thank you also, of course, to the interpreters without whom we couldn't speak the same language. So really critical in allowing us to exchange information and learn together. Just a note that the recording of today's session will be available on the YouTube channel via harveststrategies.org. Also, I'm advised that the next webinar under this program will be in July. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for news on the next topic and discussion. Thanks so much for everyone coming along and contributing to the conversation today. And we'll see you all in July. Thanks a lot.